Hello, today we are going to consider the medieval art of Western and Central Europe. Let's firstly start with the periodization. The medieval art of Western and Central Europe passed through three stages in its development. The first one is the pre-Romanesque period from 6th to 10th centuries, then Romanesque period from 11th to 12th centuries, and Gothic period, end of the 12th and 13th, 14th centuries. Romanesque art, architecture, sculpture, and painting, characteristic of the first of two great international artistic areas that flourished in Europe during the Middle Ages. So we start with Romanesque, and later in our next lectures we'll keep on talking about the Gothic style. The art of this period was inseparable from religion. It resulted from the great expansion of monasticism in the 10th and 11th centuries, when Europe first regained a measure of political stability after the fall of the Roman Empire. This was the time of appearance of several large monastic orders. Here churches had to be larger than previous ones in order to accommodate increased numbers of priests and monks, and allow access to pilgrims who wished to worship the saints' relics kept in the churches. So the purpose of art was to inspire the viewer with the greatness of God. Romanesque art, architecture, sculpture, and painting flourished in Europe during the Middle Ages. Romanesque architecture emerged about 1000 and lasted until about 1150, by which time it had evolved into Gothic. The Romanesque was at its height between 1075 and 1125 in France, Italy, Britain, and the German lands. The name Romanesque itself refers to the fusion of Roman traditions. Romanesque architectural builders, they borrowed elements from Roman architecture, such as rounded arches and columns, hence the term Romanesque. So, to fulfill new functions, Romanesque churches evolved the extensive use of the semicircular, so-called Roman arch for windows, doors, and arcades, and also a barrel-walled when arches forming a half-cylindrical vault over a rectangular space, or groin vaults. So all these examples you can see in the slide. These groin vaults, they formed by the intersection of two arches to support the roof of the nave, and also massive piers and walls with a few windows to contain the extremely forceful outward thrust of the arched walls. They began to build churches in the shape of the Latin cross. So the example here you can see in the slide. The pilgrim would enter the church through the nave. As usual, we can see the central part is called nave. The relics of the church would be held and displayed in the area of the high altar. The early Christian basilica plan, longitudinal with the side aisles and an apse, was expanded to accommodate the functions of large churches. The typical Romanesque church also had side aisles along the nave with galleries above them, a large tower over the crossing of the nave and transepts, and some smaller towers at the church's western end. The barrel-vault of Romanesque churches were typically divided by shafts. These are engaged columns and diaphragm arches into square bays or compartments. This division was an essential characteristic that distinguished Romanesque architecture from its Carolingian or Atton predecessors. In this slide we can see the main terminologies, the main vocabulary, so let's get familiar with it. Transept, what is that? It is a transverse part of any building which lies across the main body of the edifice or the nave. So let me show you in the previous slide. So here it is the transept. We can see also choir. Choir, this is an area of the church or cathedral that provides seating for the clergy and also church choir. It is the western part of the altar between the nave and the sanctuary. Here it is in the slide. Then the next term is ambulatory, semicircular bypass gallery around the altar formed by the continuation of the aisles. Through it people can get to small apse chapels without leaving the temple. So here is this part. Then the next one is narthex. Narthex, the entrance or lobby area in the church located at the west end of the nave opposite the church's main altar. Porch, from porta, passage, a room or gallery located in front of the entrance like a vestibule or a hall. Then chevet, in French churches it is a ring of chapels. So they are usually located in the eastern part of the church. Archivolt, it is an ornamental molding or band following the curve of the outside of the arch. We'll see it next. And another decorative item is tympanum or lunette. It is in-depth part of arch above the entrance. Let's talk about the general characteristics of Roman architecture. So we usually see that actually there is a great usage of sculptural decoration, especially on portals, capitals, and other surfaces. Then we'll see some painting decorations throughout the interior, but it is comparatively, we will see a smaller amount of it. Then a transept, it is a section crossing the nave at the right angle, giving the church a cross shape. So it is a usual element. Then I remind you about the Latin cross type plan when the sides of transept and nave are not equal. So when nave part is longer than transept as usual. Also, we can see ambulatory around the apse, multiple towers, usually at the west and over the transept crossing. Okay, let's consider the elements of the cathedral on the example of the cathedral in Worms. So we can see entrance, we can see the main entrance through the western part, then we get inside of the central nave. On the sides there are two aisles, they are smaller than the nave. We can see the transept here, it is smaller than the nave. Above the transection of the nave and transept there is a tower. Actually, it looks like the dome on the drum that we could see that is typical for the Byzantine period, but it has a different type of plan. Then there are different towers on the sides of the structure. We have always, so they are located according to the principle of symmetry here. And of course, the most sacred part of the church is located in the eastern part. Here the western choir is mentioned. So what is Romanesque architecture in general? We should underline it again that Romanesque architecture was inspired by Roman architecture. There are some typical elements that were very widespread in ancient Roman times, such as a semicircular arch. First of all, they are even called a Roman type of arch. Also, we can notice that actually, in Romanesque architecture, there were some influences from Visigothic, Carolingian, Byzantine, and Islamic architecture. So we can't say that this is pure. This is the style that totally given the interpretation of ancient Roman tradition, for example. So yeah, it had some elements from different cultures. Then we should also remember that this type of architecture, it really had some defensive view. So the walls were thick, the plans of churches, they were more orienting on the horizontal composition. So we can see in general that there were harmonious proportions, stone barrel walled or groin walled, thick and heavy walls, thick and heavy pillars, small windows. By the way, there are several reasons for this. First of all, we remember that in those times, in the medieval times, there were some, I can say, the system of heating was not that perfect, and that's why it was very important to preserve right temperature inside of the premises, and for this purpose, in this case, the smaller windows, they help to do this. Then another purpose is of course defensive. Through smaller windows, it was harder, for example, to throw an arrow inside of the premises to destroy it, and so on. Then we can see the great amount of round arches supporting the roof. Then round so-called blind arches used extensively for decoration inside and out, especially in exteriors. Nave with side aisles, though some models church are aisleless at all. Then galleries above the side aisles separated from the nave by a triforium. Triforium, these are such kind of windows that are look like 3 in 1. So, or in other words, this is like one window that is divided into 3 parts by small columns or semicolumns. Among the main characteristics of Romanesque temples, let's repeat it again: massive walls and towers, powerful supports bearing the weight of cylindrical and cross walls, semicircular arches and portal ends, the prevalence of horizontals, clear stoichiometry of volumes, a clear separation of spatial cells, rhyme severity, compact forms, consciousness and clarity of silhouette. Among some features, so in different countries, we understand that Romanesque architecture, it had some national specificity. For example, in architecture of France, we can see the usage of double columns with the decorated capitals, also wide range of round arches, narrow base without glazing or tracery, stainless glass of large openings with gradually developing in the north of the country. Different wall styles were combined in French Romanesque architecture: long choir, side aisles around the semicircular sanctuary forming the ambulatory in which radiating chapels open. And in Provence we could see pointed domes and facades decorated with arches. So here in the slide we can see the examples of French Romanesque architecture: Saint Trophime Cathedral and Saint Sernin, Toulouse. In this slide we can see the decoration of the entrance, so of the main entrance that to the church that is located from the western part of it. So the first thing we're going to consider is lunette or tympanum. So this is a semi-circular or semi-oval shape that is located above the doors. As usual, it contained the motif from the Bible, some very important from the theologian point of view depiction from the New Testament, for example. So as usual, we could see there the images of the Last Judgment that should remind those people who are going to enter the church the main idea, so the main purpose of Christian life. That Christian should live his life in a pure way to avoid falling from grace. Then the entrance has such kind of inframing. It's usually extremely beautiful with the usage of a plenitude of different reliefs, with floral fauna motifs, with even with the images, even with some figurative compositions that are quite complicated and that contain the subjects from the Bible again. Here we can see semi-figures, semicircular figures, or sometimes even round sculptures that are usually decorating the entrance. These are usually the depictions of different saints or prophets, for example, from the Old Testament period. So this part, this enframing, is called archivolt or ring. Here we can see the example of the entrance decoration. So above the entrance, above the portal, the doors, the main doors in the western part of the church, we can see the tympanum or lunette with the depiction of Jesus Christ Pantocrator in the spheric in the background of a sphere that is symbolically, it means the universal space. And on the sides from him we can see the symbolical depictions of four evangelists here. Okay, what else? We can notice all around the images of saints. Here in the archival decoration we can notice the images of angels because they are close to God. Then lower, according to the hierarchy basing on the sacred text, we can see the images of saints here. They are sitting in the rows. Then lower we can see the images also of saints, of prophets, for example. And according to the tradition of medieval architecture, sometimes we can even notice the images of different like mythology creatures that sometimes frighten us even. But that all reflects one of the principles, that the church is like a model of the universe, and in universe there are always several sides. Everything that subordinates to God's will, so all the good sides of life, and also there is some dark side of life, and actually, so these combinations they remind somehow not only they can also tell us about punishment after the last judgment. They can remind people about that, and so for them to understand the necessity to live the right way in this earthly life. So here, for example, is the fortress of Carcassonne in France. So here we can notice that the fortress itself, it has enclosed composition. It is surrounded by thick walls, even several rows of them, and inside there is great amount of different buildings, facilities for different social needs. So that is actually somehow we can compare it to the architecture of ancient Greek Acropolis, for example. I remind you that these were cities located on some high points. So this way, the Greeks, they had an opportunity to look around to. And from the defensive purposes, that was also very important. Not to look around, just to be ahead of some situations, maybe to notice some people, some enemies from distance. So the right location of the city or fortress that usually was very important in antiquity and medievalism also. Here we can see another example of Romanesque architecture in France. We can see here the eastern part of the church, the semicircular arch, also the towers here, and we can notice that again the composition is horizontally oriented. The church is not higher than is not that high comparatively to later Gothic churches, for example. Another term, a new term for us, is donjon. So what is a donjon? So what is a donjon or keep? Keep is the tallest and the most massive tower or feudal castle of the 11th and 12th centuries, located separately in the territory of the courtyard, the refuge of the feudal lord and his family. In this slide we can see the keep's plan, and in the center of the building is a hanged balcony where the arrows were located. Let's consider Notre Dame la Grande church in Poitiers in France that was constructed between 1130 and 1145. The plan of the church is composed of a central nave with aisles, so the barrel vault has a slightly flattened silhouette, whereas the aisles are covered with groined vault. The sculpture of the west front of the western facade, here you can see in the slide, it contains motifs of Adam, Eve, and Nebuchadnezzar II. So above the door, these images are located above the door. A panel of high relief can be seen. This illustrates some passages from the Bible. The selected scenes taken from both Testaments tell about the Annunciation and the incarnation of God on earth in the person of Jesus Christ to save humanity. From left to right may be seen the topic about the original scene, Nebuchadnezzar's king of Babylon, the prophets Daniel, Moshe, Isaac, and Jeremiah. They are followed by the Annunciation, the tree of Jesus, and the depiction of King David. This first half of the panel portraying those who foresee the appearance, the birth of the Savior in the Old Testament, and the Annunciation and the ancestors of the Virgin evokes the relationship which exists between the Old Testament and New Testament in the Christian Church. On the other side of the entrance there may be seen the visitation, the topic of the visitation between the towns of Nazareth and Jerusalem. So we can notice the great amount of different illustrations on the western facade. It really reminds us some stone lace. We can even compare it to this. And all these figurative images, let's again consider them. They are extremely decorative. They are flattened, and together with the ornamental motifs, they remind us some patterns. Now let's talk about the Romanesque architecture in Germany. So what is special about it? We won't see that great decoration of Western entrances as in the churches of France. The architecture itself, more oriented on the constructive features. The plan of the churches are peculiar in having Western and Eastern apses. Then we can see rich in the circular, we can see great amount of circular and octagonal turrets in conjunction with the polygonal domes and the use of arcaded galleries under eaves. The most richly decorated ornamented parts are the doorways and capitals of columns. Here we can see, we should remember another term typical for Romanesque architecture. This is turret, a small tower that projects vertically from the wall of the building, such as a medieval castle. It is the element of military fortification. Here we can see the example of the Romanesque German architecture, the high cathedral of St. Peter and Trier, that was constructed between 2035 up to 2070. So we can see that the plan looks quite complicated, but from another point of view, the church is still symmetrical. It has the elongated type of plan that we call basilica. We see here the semicircular apse, the great usage of a semicircular Roman arcade. St. Martin's Cathedral also, so we can notice still clear proportions of masses of architecture. We can notice that constructive features of it, so they are like underlined here. We won't see here like the lace of reliefs of round sculptures, semicircular high relief images here. Everything is more laconic, comparing to the French architecture, more strict. But anyway, there is beauty in these combinations of clear combinations of proportions and architectural masses. St. Maria's Church in Larch, that was constructed between the beginning of the 12th centuries and was ended at the beginning of the 13th centuries. And again, so what can we see here? The same. We can see the symmetrical structure, usage of semicircular arches. By the way, I want to underline here that we can see sometimes the usage of windows like this when they are divided into three parts. In this case, they are called triforium. And in this case, when we see double window, actually this is one window but divided into two parts, like semicircular arch with a small column. So these are biforium. This is St. Peter's Dome, Worms Dome, church in Worms, also in Germany. Again, we can see this clear silhouette. We can see that the central nave is much bigger than side aisles. We can see all the usage of towers and the massive proportions. Here it is from another side. We can also notice that the apse here has such kind of like faceted structure. Also, the church is decorated with circular windows that are called windows rows, and they will be more widespread in later Gothic architecture. Here we can see the castle structure in southeast England, Rochester Castle, the 20th century keep or stone tower. So let's pay attention to very thick walls, to defensive type of the structure, to tiny or we can say comparatively small windows here, horizontally oriented composition in general. Okay, what about Romanesque in Italy? We'll see some influences because of the specificity of geographical position of Italy and the routes to different countries through the Mediterranean Sea. These different opportunities for combining cultural motifs from different directions. We'll see the influences of Arabic world, of South, for example, of Byzantine, of course. We'll see here that usually the church it consisted of such kind of architectural composition of three separate buildings like church, baptistry, and bell tower that were located close to each other, but anyway they were not attached to each other. Here in the slide below we can see Pisa Cathedral in Tuscany. It presents three separate buildings also. Here we can see it in the slide. Actually, Pisa Cathedral is extremely decorative, so we'll see the great usage of different marbles that cover and lay the facade of all these three structures. Baptistery itself was designed by D.O.T. Salvi. It has the circular plan with central space, or in other words, with nave. And then it is known that the diameter contains is 18.3 meters. It is separated by 4 piers and 8 columns from the surrounding two-storied aisle, which makes the building nearly 39.3 meters in diameter. All the facades are decorated with different sorts of arcades. A semicircular arch motif is used here. Then we can also notice the so-called pointed arch, or also they have another title, lancet-like arch. So then we can see double windows, or in other words, these are windows divided into two parts, and I remind you, they are called biforium. This architecture is closer, comparing, for example, this Romanesque architecture to a German tradition and to French tradition. Then, for sure, it's closer to French tradition because it is as decorative. But actually, different motifs are used here, and different types of plans were favorable among the architects. Here we can see this baptistery inside. We can notice the concentric type composition, the rows of semicircular arcade that divides the central part of baptistery into two main rows, two main parts. We can see the decoration of with marble and the usage of columns with the Corinthian capitals. Now let's consider the Tower of Pisa. These towers that have the cylindrical type of structure, they have the circular type of the plan. They are called campanile in Italian tradition. Campanile was created also between 1173 and ended in 1350. It is a separately standing structure that is inlaid, covered from all sides by several rows of semicircular arcade galleries. It has some axial deviation, exactly 4 and 2 meters. The author of the work was Master Bonanno. The central body of the structure is composed of the hollow cylinder. It is formed by an external wall facing of shaped ashlars and white and gray San Giuliano limestone, an inner wall facing also of worked limestone, and between these two wall facing an annular masonry area. Within this masonry area is a spiral stair which is contained of 293 steps that climb in 6 rows. Okay, here we can see the inner space of this campanile. The cathedral is dedicated to the Dormition of the Virgin Mary. Originally, it is called Duomo di Santa Maria Assunta. So, Pisa Cathedral, it was erected from 1063 to 1092. There are known 2 names of architects. The main architect is considered being Buscetto, and only in one source we also find the name of the master Rinaldo. Probably he was the master who finished this general project and who worked especially on the facades. So anyway, we should remember these two names of masters. It is also known that firstly Pisan Cathedral had the Greek type cross plan, and later on it was rebuilt, and now we can see the Latin type cross plan here. So in other words, the nave part is elongated here. We can see the transept part also. The inner part of the nave is divided into 5 rows by 4 rows of columns here. The proportions of this structure are really harmonious. We can notice that it really reminds us the Byzantine basilicas. Also, we can see the delicacy of the ornamentations, a great amount of marble decoration elements. Especially, we can see the bands of red and white marble. There is also the timber roof. Here is the western facade. As we can notice, there are three entrances. The main one is bigger, and all the surface is decorated with colorful sorts of marbles, and with several rows of semicircular arcades that somehow create the feeling of a weightless construction. Inside, we can see the plenitude of decorated elements. We can notice that the inner space looks extremely spatial because of the usage of contrast sort of marbles, black and white. There are mosaics, decoration, and also fresco depictions in the highest peak of this cathedral in the dome space. Here it is. So the main entrance leads to the most sacred part of the church, that is called an apse, and in the corner of an apse there is a big image of Jesus Christ Pantocrator, created according to the best traditions of Byzantine icon painting. We should also underline that in this architecture there are the elements of different styles. Firstly, that are Byzantine, Lombardian, and sometimes even Mosque elements of their architecture. So this cathedral became so special that that sometimes we can even see such kind of term that this is the example of not simply Romanesque architecture, but of Pisan Romanesque architecture as something separate, something elaborate. One of the aim of the construction of these temples was to create something better, something more beautiful and powerful than in Venice, for example, because as we remember, Italy, they always competed with each others. I mean, different parts of the state, the country, they competed in their political power, in their influence. So that was one of the purposes of this rich beauty in the cathedral. Now let's consider the Romanesque sculpture. Sculpture was revealed in Western Europe during the Romanesque period after almost 600 years of dormancy. Relief sculpture was used to depict biblical, historical, and church doctrine on the capitals of columns and around the massive doors of churches. A relative stylistic freedom from the classical figural tradition, a heritage of angular Germanic design, and the inspiration of religion combined to produce a distinctive style of sculpture. Natural objects were freely transformed into visionary images that derive their power from abstract linear design and from expansive distortion and stylization. In this slide we can see an example, the image of Apostle created about 1090 in the facade of the Church of Saint Sernin in Toulouse. So the images are the images are extremely stylized. We can see that in medievalism, everything was subordinated to the ideas of the church, and actually there was an attempt to look further, not to pay attention to the features of the body, to proportions of figure, to everything that was so important in antiquity, for example, for Greeks, for Romans. But the purpose of art here is different. It should reflect the inner idea, the deep meaning that is explained in sacred texts. That's why the artist sculptures, they moved away from materialization of the shapes they created something quite distinct from real life images, and so they turned these shapes to some signs in order to read the main messages in the easiest way, not just to admire the beauty of shape, but to think of the meaning that is hidden in these images. So here we can see that the proportions of figures are elongated frequently. Sometimes they are shortened controversially. So the compositions are also quite symbolical. We can notice that we can compare this composition of the Last Judgment from the tympanum of cathedral in Autun, for example, to the compositional principles of the images of ancient Egypt. So there we could notice also the location of the elements of composition on the rows, through the rows, and here is the same thing. In the central part of the composition there is the highly stylized image of Jesus Christ. We can say that his figure is dematerialized, and actually this is like transfiguration of the material shape into something, into high spiritual side of it. Around Jesus Christ's depiction we can see the motive of punishment, and so here we can see the rows of people that are going to be judged in the last judgment day. We can see the torture, we can see suffering of people that didn't pass this last exam, and we can see some ugly creatures, demons here, and also we can see angels. So the image this way is extremely informative, and the location above the main entrance to the church is not accidental, because a person who is going to enter the sacred space of the Christian church should start thinking about the most important things in this temporary life, and get ready to give his final answer. So, and attending church is like the way to be to save the soul. That's the main message of such kind of image. Here is the fragment from this composition, Jesus Pantocrator depiction. So we can see that actually in medieval period, artists in general, they had this very strong feeling of stylization. For example, sometimes we can hear that medieval times are just like only compared to dark times, to dark ages, and like art was in its low level of development. But actually we can't claim this way when we look attentively at all these images. Actually, given stylized, making stylization sometimes is much more difficult for an artist than to create a realistic image, because in the second point, in realism, the artist should be just a great master. He should know all the he should know all the principles of construction of the body proportions, muscles, and some technical sides of the work. But when we see the stylized image, we should understand that there is a great level of finding the main and reducing something extra. So stylization, it's always about accentuating on something and avoiding detailization. That is about analytics in art. So the archivolt is decorated with marvelous figures. These are sometimes really, predominantly these are reliefs, and sometimes these are extremely high relief images, like this, for example. So they are still attached to the surface of architecture, but anyway they look quite spacious and volume. Some subjects, they contain the images of evangelists, for example, and of course some symbolical messages, like grain, for example, the symbol of wine, and wine, the symbol of blood of Jesus Christ. And that's all about Eucharism, like the way to the sacred, the Eucharism, like the central sacrament of the Christian Church that leads to saving the soul. Here, for example, we can see the motive of from the Old Testament about the first people, Eve tempting Adam with an apple, with the serpent in the tree. The compositions were created the way to give them fulfilling information about the subject in a very short time. So many people in medievalism, they were not able to read or write, for example. So they when they got inside the church, or when they entered, so when they came closer to church or inside of it, they started reading these images, so the images, they had some enlightenment purposes to explain the main doctrines of Christian Church. And on the right side, we can see Moshe grinding the Old Testament into the New with Saint Paul. Such kind of symbolical depiction that underlines this transition, this combination of the ideas and the story that is described in Old Testament period and the New Testament period. And all these images are just simply, we can say that is capitals of columns. So the surface is not that big, but the images are very informative. Another topic is lust and torment, that also like explains the reason, the action, and the punishment. This masterpiece depicts Eve. She is taking the apple from the tree, and we can also see the image of a serpent there. So this composition is extremely decorative. It is, and even we can compare it to some artworks of contemporary artists that really appreciate the heritage of the past. The composition itself is very harmonious. The outlines are smooth. We can see that even the nudity of Eve's figure, it does not have this sensual beginning. So we just notice here the inner idea of this image. The monumental figurative images are highly stylized also. We can notice some changes of the proportions of the people's figures. They are not realistic. For example, here on the example of the portal of Orthard Cathedral in Germany, we can see that heads proportionally are bigger than they should be. But from position, considering these figures from the lower point of view, they look not that big. Another feature are heavy draperies. They are not the echo of figure of a person as it used to be in the period of ancient Greek sculpture and ancient Roman sculptures. But these heavy draperies, they cover the body. We can see that, we can say even that they hide the anatomy, the musculature of the body, and dematerialize them. Now let's consider Hildesheim Gate, the Burnwell doors, so-called, that were made of bronze from 1008 to 1015. This is the central portal of the western facade of St. Michael's Church, Hildesheim, Germany. Hildesheim Gate is a pair of Attonian or Romanesque bronze doors. So they were made originally for Hildesheim Cathedral in Germany. The doors show relief images from the Bible, scenes from the book of Genesis on the left door, and from the life of Jesus on the right door. They are considered a masterpiece of Attonian art, the oldest known monumental image cycle in German sculpture, and also the oldest cycle of images cast in metal in Germany. The total weight of doors is circa 1,850 kilograms. The height of each doors is 4.72 meters and 1.5 meters wide. The uniqueness of the gates lies in the technical performance. For the first time since the times of Roman Empire, the doors were cast out entirely, not from the separate plates as they did in Byzantium and Italy. So these are the first medieval bronze doors decorated with an extensive cycle of reliefs on the plots of Holy Scripture. These works anticipate the birth of monumental relief in Romanesque art. It is necessary to remember that in the Middle Ages a symbolic interpretation of images was adopted. The Old Testament was considered the prefiguration of the New Testament. According to the Apostle Paul, the Old Testament is the shadow of the future. In the location and comparison of plots laid a multi-valued meaning. The Burnwell dolls depict scenes from the books of Genesis on left door, as I have already mentioned, and these sceneries, they are arranged in parallel to the scenes from the Gospel. The scenes are organized the way to create this story parallels. So, for example, the formation of Eve somehow compared to Noli me tangere, like the symbol of paradise lost and then paradise gained. Noli me tangere, I remind you that is the Latin title of the moment after the resurrection of Jesus Christ, when the Mary Magdalene, she saw the Lord, she saw her teacher alive, and she wanted to touch him. She wanted to hug him, probably that to feel that he was really alive. So she got some emotions about that, of course, and he stopped her in this emotional reflection and told her not to do that, because he was already in another transfigurated feature. So he was in another like not as a material man already, so he referred to the higher world already after the resurrection. Then Eve presented to Adam salutations, the three Marys and the tomb. Then temptation and fall. So the topic of falling from grace, the topic of the first of the betrayal of God's will, and the crucifixion. Why the crucifixion? Because, for example, Here we can see that one of the leading motifs is tree of knowledge, that symbolizes sin, and the crucifixion is tree of life, that means salvation. The judgment of the judgment of Adam and Eve, and judgment of Jesus by Pilate. The topic of judgment. So again, these parallels were found. Expulsion from paradise and a presentation of Jesus in temple. Expulsion from paradise was the result of the temptation and fall of Adam and Eve, the first people. And the presentation of Jesus in temple, this was the moment after his birth, when the Virgin Mary brought him to the temple, and Saint Simon made sure that truly the Messiah was born from the Virgin. And we can see the topic of, so that is the topic of separation from God and the return, like the reunion with God. Adam and Eve working, and adoration of the Magi. So what's common in the subjects? Firstborn sons of Eve, Cain and Mary, Jesus, poverty and wealth. Then offerings by Cain, grain, and Abel, lamb, and the nativity. Abel, sacrificial lamb, and Jesus, lamb of God. Then Cain slain Abel, and the Annunciation, the topic of despair, sin, murder, and the topic of hope and everlasting life. So these parallels can be hardly seen if we do not have enough theological knowledge, if we do not know the sacred text totally and deeply. But anyway, we can feel that we can see that the people of medieval times, they were so deep in their symbolical way of thinking. Also, we should mention that the plots from the Old Testament on the left side of the doors, they should be read from top down, according to chronology, and on the right side from the bottom up. The left door depicts the increasing estrangement of humanity from God, from top to bottom, the creation, the fall, Cain's murder of Abel. And the right doors show the redemptive work of Christ from bottom to top. The Annunciation and Nativity, the Passion, the Resurrection, the depictions of the right door, in which the birth and childhood of Jesus are followed immediately by his Passion and Resurrection. And this is not by chance. Plots of both doors are viewed not only in chronological order, but also in pairs. Thus, each scene of the Old Testament corresponds to the plot from the New one. For example, the fall, the beginning of evil on earth, corresponds to the crucifixion, atonement of original sin. Then, exile from paradise, the separation of man from God. Bringing to the temple, it means returning to God. And number 8 itself, the number of sins on each leaf, served as a symbol of eternity. Sins on each part of the doors are the symbol of eternity. The compositions are have their individual characterizations, and so these separate scenes are simple and effective, so they can be easily read. The plots are very obvious here. As usual in medieval art, the figures are not individualized, but they repeat a few stylized types. They have the disproportionately large oval faces, which are characteristic of pre-Romanesque sculpture. Their almond-shaped eyes sit in flat sockets that sharply delineated eyebrows. Nevertheless, the facial expressions of some figures are very individual and match the figure's gesture. And now let's talk about monumental painting. Here we can see the ceiling painting of the Church of St. Michael. St. Michael's Church is one of the most important churches of early Christian period architecture. It is a double choir basilica with 2 transepts and square tower at each crossing. The west choir is emphasized by the ambulatory and a crypt. The ceiling of the church is decorated with a fresco, 27.6 meters long and 8.7 meters wide, depicting the Tree of Jesus, the line of ancestral line of Jesus Christ. In other words, the painted wooden ceiling in the nave created around 1230 shows the genealogy of Christ. It is one of the only monumental panel painting of the High Middle Ages that have survived. The famous Bernwald doors, featuring bronze reliefs and scenes from the Bible, were originally commissioned for St. Michael's Church, but are now found at the nearby Cathedral of Hildesheim. What about the iconography and stylistics of the ceiling painting? So firstly, let's pay attention to the high level of stylization. The images are two-dimensional. There is no attempt to depict the figures or the space in a three-dimensional way, somehow to show the real-life effect of the perspective changes of the linear and air perspective. Here we can see that the images can be clearly seen from the big distance because they are located in a high point of the church, and the subjects should be identified in the most easy way for us. So we can see the bright color combinations. The painting itself combines red, blue, and some other colors. The compositions are predominantly centric type, so we can see they are symmetrical, quite stateable and clear. Here is another example that is located in the crypt of San Isidoro at Leon in Spain. So this example is more about the clear stylistics of the Byzantine Empire. So we can see that the image of Christ Pantocrator here in the vault is totally created according to all the principles, canonical, iconographical stylization of Byzantine time. So what's the main difference? What can we say about that? That the images of the Western Europe, they are more illustrative. Of course, in those medieval period, they are we can say that somehow they subordinate to the general to some general principle, and this principle it is actual for it's relevant both for Italian churches and to Spanish churches, for example, to Byzantine churches, but some changes are reflected in these images. For example, we can notice the plentitude of some additional elements, additional ornamentation. These ornaments, they do not have, sometimes they do not have any symbolical deep meaning, controversially to the Byzantine images. During the Romanesque period, there were a number of regional schools of art that converged, and in that period they were created a great amount of different illuminated manuscripts and illustrated books. Of course, predominantly we are talking about illustration to the Bible and some other sacred canonical texts. So the main schools of Aton book miniature are represented in this slide. This scheme was compiled by Zorich. So we can see the illustration to the register of Saint Gregory 983, then Psalm book of Egbert 985, then Codex of Egbert also. So and the New Testament illustration, for example, and some other sacred texts that were highly illustrated. Even from the scheme, we can see some differences of stylistics. We can see different color combinations and the level of detailization and generalization. Here is the miniature from the Book of Darrow. The Book of Darrow is a medieval illuminated manuscript gospel book that is created in the insular art style. It was probably created between 650 and 700. The place of creation may perhaps have been Darrow Abbey in Ireland, or a monastery in Northumbria in northeastern England. Insular art style, it is also called Hiberno-Saxon art, is the style of art that produced in the post-Roman history of Ireland and Britain. The term derives from insula, the Latin term for island. It originates from the Irish monastic movement of Celtic Christianity. Such art is characterized by love to spirals, tricklers, circles, and other geometrical motifs. These were combined with animal forms, probably mainly deriving from the Germanic version of the general Eurasian animal style, though also from Celtic art. Actually, for Celtic art can be easily identified, and it can be it really varies from any other source of images because of a very complicated ornamental motifs. These motifs usually contain the zoomorphic images, so the images of different mythical creatures that are highly in a complicated way combined with each other. The motifs of animals that are beating each other, they are fighting, and actually that images could frighten the viewer, but they are combined in such a magnificent ornament that looks really impressive, that we got some other feelings about them. The bodies of people were stylized in this way, in the way so that they more remind us some sign, very generalized, even we can see some geometrical motifs used here, and they combine in a great level of harmony with the ornamentation around. Here is the illustration from the Gospel of Otto III, created circa 1000 and located in Munich Library. The Gospel of Otto III is the Codex, is one of the most significant illuminated Attonian manuscripts from the early Middle Ages to ever reach modern times. The Codex is thought to have been written and illuminated around the 10th century, and so it contains 34 full-page miniatures. The pages of the Gospels of Otto III manuscript are made of parchment. The script is written in ink, with gold initials, and the manuscript is expansively illustrated with portraits of 4 evangelists, so the authors of 4 Gospels, and scenes from the life of Christ, as well as the ruler portraits. On the right side of the double page, Emperor Otto III is shown seated frontally, crowned and holding a golden orb and a scepter, surmounted by an eagle. Otto III was the Holy Empire, nominally ruled over territories corresponding to modern-day Germany, France, and northern Italy. Otto III was the Roman Emperor from 996 to 1002. He died at the very young age of 21. Otto III looks out at us with hypnotic eyes. He is dressed in green and the imperial purple. He is flanked on either sides by members of the court. On the right by those who fight. These are two members of the nobility who carry a sword, lance and shield, and on the left by those who pray, two members of the clergy who hold books. From this image we can notice that again it is highly stylized, the image is flattened, it is two-dimensional. Anyway, it reminds us the iconography of Byzantine icon paintings. Another example of illuminated manuscripts are the Evangelia of Uta Abbess from Niedermünster, the depiction from the Evangelia of Otto III that we have already considered, the depiction of Saint Luke, for example. We can see that all these pages were highly, they were created in a high professional way, and there is the usage of not only of paints of different bright colors, but also of golden leaf. And now let's consider the one composition, the same topic, the miracle of the dove, in 3 versions. So here we can see the moment when Pope Gregory the Great is depicted during his work. So he is writing the same text. This image is from the Register of Saint Gregory, created circa 983 and kept in Trier. What does it mean? Why do we see such kind of image here everywhere, that there is a white dove? So we remember from the lectures about the Byzantine period that the white dove is the symbol of the Holy Spirit. So it means that not the Pope Gregory himself is the author of the sacred text, but it means that he is inspired, these texts are inspired by the Holy Spirit. Here we can see the same topic from the Sacrament of Metz, created between 869 up to 877. Here on the last example, on the next image, in the next image, we can see also the same subject, but in bone carving, created from between 990 to 1000 and kept in Vienna. So what's the difference? The topic is the same, but the compositional principles, locations of figures of the heroes of this plot are totally different. The next item we are going to consider is the Bayeux tapestry. So it is an embroidered cloth nearly 70 meters long and 50 centimeters tall. It depicts the events leading up to the Norman conquest of England. It is thought to date to the 11th century, within a few years after the battle. The tapestry consists of 75 scenes with Latin inscriptions that are called tituli, depicting the events leading up to the Norman conquest and culminating in the Battle of Hastings in 1066. It is sometimes viewed as the type of chronicle and characterized by the needlework of really high quality. So we have considered the Romanesque, the basic artworks of the Romanesque period. So we have considered the main principles and directions in art of the medieval period, especially the Romanesque style, the Romanesque period. Thank you for your attention.